Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 22nd of February 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson, and we will be joined by live Skype link by Mark Anderson from American Free Press, who's going to be speaking all the way from Dallas in Texas, where he informs us there is no weather this morning, but I can let you know that's because he probably hasn't looked out of his hotel window. Well, here in Plymouth, it's pretty grey and cold, hence the sweaters today in the UK column studio. But we understand the rest of the country is not too bad. It's fairly bright, if cloudy, in London and Norfolk. And it appears that it's North Wales that's getting the best of the weather at the moment because they've actually got some sunshine. So there we are. Can't all be bad in Wales. Well, Mike, you were going to take us straight into the report by Mark Anderson.
Yeah, so last week we mentioned Justice Scalia, the High Court judge, the Supreme Court judge who passed away. And Mark, there seemed to be, I hadn't appreciated that there seemed to be some questions about how he died, actually.
Well, what I'm actually bringing up here is the San Antonio Express News. What I found intriguing, and it hasn't been discussed much in any news outlets, is that right out of the starting gate, a mere couple of days or so after the Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia was found dead under at least somewhat suspicious circumstances, right away the San Antonio News is ridiculing those that have questions. Granted, some people have asked some silly questions in a way, but the news media, rather than investigating itself, poking harder at what might have happened to Scalia, instead ridicules those that ask questions. And the San Antonio Express News took the lead in that posting that you're showing, in saying that, oh, people are, alleging conspiracy theories. Well, the mainstream media in the US, if you ask any questions outside the comfort zone, suddenly you're a conspiracy theorist. But there are lots of unanswered questions about the death of Scalia that need to be asked, and the mainstream press doesn't want to ask them. And so that's
was he not just an older man who passed away then?
Well, that could be. I'm withholding judgment, which is the proper journalistic thing to do. But you have to have some completeness. Who was there at the Cibolo Ranch in far southwest Texas, in a very remote area near the Mexican border? Why did the justice go to such a far-flung place to rest? Not that that's wrong or necessarily an untoward thing. What do you mean by natural causes? Why did the Presidio County Judge Cinderella Guevara rule over the phone that he died of natural causes? And she based that on very sketchy hearsay information. And then therefore she ruled over the phone that there would be no autopsy. But when you're dealing with someone, a figure like a Supreme Court justice who dies at least unexpectedly, if not somewhat suspiciously, there should be an autopsy as a matter of due course. But he was embalmed very quickly in a hurried way, in a rushed sort of fashion, a rush to judgment to declare it natural causes, a rush to judgment to embalm him. And the claim was, well, you can't take a body out of Texas under law unless the body's embalmed. Well, true, but you also can't autopsy a body if it's been embalmed. Excuse me. So at the very least, there's malfeasance here, or incompetence, and a lack of proper procedure. Then, of course, we could have more conclusions. But no one ever said it was conspiratorial. But right away, the San Antonio paper says, "Oh, you're asking questions. You must be a conspiracy theorist." So it just ridiculously irresponsible journalism on the part of the San Antonio paper, especially.
Mark, I wonder whether you could just remind me, this judge had actually been speaking out on particular topics? If we just focus the thing for our audience, why should we be interested in this man?
Well, I don't have a ton of that at my fingertips right at the moment. However, Scalia was a Reagan appointee under Ronald Reagan, the former president here, and he was arguably the most constitutionalist, the most conservative. In a British framework, he'd be the most pro Magna Carta, you might say. excuse me. And so he could be expected to come down in favor of the Second Amendment, in favor of the right to bear arms. He could be expected to come down against abortion across the board. He could, and Planned Parenthood was pushed back on its heels recently when they were almost completely federally defunded due to the tissue and the baby tissue and organ sale racket that was blown open through some guerrilla journalism. So Scalia was a threat to the abortion mill, the Planned Parenthood mill. This does not imply a tit for tat or any kind of cause and effect, but he was with him gone. The court can be completely reoriented toward a more liberal, kind of aggressive socialist policy, if you will.
Mark, and of course that was something which basically appeared in the mainstream news almost as soon as he was dead, and the argument then about whether Obama was going to get a somebody that he wanted actually selected for this, or whether the Republicans were going to veto any Obama nomination. Is this argument still going on, and is it anything more than a circus act, really?
It's largely a circus act. One of the other deplorable states of the U.S. media is shown right there, Brian and Mike, that the media immediately wants to jump into, oh, what's Obama going to do? Who's he going to appoint? Will the Republicans approve his appointment in the Senate? Scalia's body is, you might say, not even cold yet, metaphorically speaking, and a lot more questions need to be asked about his death, even though you can't avoid talking about who will replace him. But they're trying to rush this along, rush to judgment. Nothing to see here, folks. They're not doing due diligence in the U.S. media to, complete the reports and get a more thorough explanation of what happened.
Okay, well, let's move on then. You have an article in the latest American Free Press entitled, "Is the U.S. Congress Trying to Slip NAFTA Highway Past Voters?" And this is to do with the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act. Tell us a little bit about this.
Well, for years here in Texas, was one of the reasons I'm in Texas a lot, is I've covered the construction piecemeal of the NAFTA superhighway. In Texas, it's been known as the Trans-Texas Corridor, TTC 69, TTC I-35. These are the numerical descriptions of a couple of these major thoroughfares.
Long story short, these are roads.
Yeah, they're rights of way. They're corridors where existing highways would be widened or new highways would be built in the form of toll loops and toll bypasses. And what it represents largely is the tolling of America, where everywhere you drive in terms of major interstates or semi-major interstates would be toll roads. There no longer would be freeways. And so driving would become a much more expensive proposition in the states. And the U.S. is already way overly dependent on automobiles. We lack the well-constructed train system that Europe and the UK have. Here it's more spotty. Of course, it's a very large country, but it would make driving much more expensive. It would allow much more freight to come through Mexico out of the Mexican Pacific Ocean ports, bringing in Chinese goods. And what this article is about, and that bill you mentioned, Mike, is that the big highway bill in the U.S. Congress, which was stalled for like 10 years, and they kept just kind of renewing parts of it. Well, they finally passed this big highway bill, and they slipped a lot more of these NAFTA free trade super wide highway corridors into the first full-fledged highway bill in 10 years. And these corridors basically are a network of highways, super wide corridors that go from Mexico through the U.S. to Canada. So more and more cheap imports can be flooded into the United States, which would undercut U.S. manufacturing. This lady you're showing, Terry Hall, is one of the most aggressive activists against this, as she's been for about 10 years. And in fact, I'll be in touch with her again soon, because they're trying to stop this here in Texas, which is a border state with Mexico, before it can get much further throughout the U.S. Although it's, from New York State to Washington State to Texas up to the Dakotas, it's all over, not just Texas. But it's something that's a very hard fight among the activists against the powers that be.
And of course, related to this, of course, is TPP, and you're covering more of this in the latest American Free Press. When is Congress going to ratify this?
The expectation is March or April. The free trade representative for the U.S., Michael Froman, acts as if the very oceans will evaporate and the sun will refuse to shine if Congress doesn't approve the TPP yesterday. Forgive my facetiousness, but that's how he is. And here you're showing the New Zealand official who was hit with a male rubber appendage in the face, as some of us have seen on the internet, by a citizen in New Zealand who said, "Thanks for selling out our country," or something to that effect, as she threw this appendage at him, this lewd object. And that was to symbolize, of course, the giveaway of sovereignty under the TPP. And what I'm stressing in this American Free Press article, you can look at it at americanfreepress.net. I think it'll be up soon. This is the hard copy version. What I'm stressing basically is that we need to remember that these trade deals are a different form of government. They're a governmental system. They're not just trade. They're much more than that. It's a supranational private governance system. A lot of Bilderberg input, a lot of Trilateral Commission input, and it's to superimpose on the traditional nation state, of course, and so it can run parallel to, but largely independent of, the nation state. And that there, of course, is a lot of collusion between the two.
And what's the situation with protests in the US at the moment? Is this an issue that people are still grabbing onto up until the point of ratification? Are they still trying to avoid that?
There's some protest. People are so harangued and diverted by this presidential circus here, Mr. Trump et al., all of them. And then there's the Scalia affair that we talked about, where the media is just botching the whole thing. There's a lot of diversions, of course, there in the UK as well as here for the American mind in this kind of information war that the mainstream media and their government allies conduct day out, day in and day out. And people are just all over the place. But I think as ratification approaches in the House, the U.S. House, I think more protests will happen, particularly in Washington, and I intend to try to be there when they do.
But it is going to be ratified?
It's going to be a tough battle, especially in the House. It's going to be one of the most tense, dramatic votes in a long, long time. There's going to be a lot of emotion. It's going to get dirty. People trying to bend arms to get other people to vote their way. It's going to get really heated.
Right. Well, you mentioned Donald Trump a moment ago, so let's not forget to mention him just briefly again. What's this story about? Somebody's actually putting up some money to try to stop him. Is that the case?
Yeah, this is kind of a brief mention. I found this before our show today. Yeah, the interesting thing is this Marlene Ricketts, the lady you're showing there. She's the mother of the Nebraska governor, Pete Ricketts. And Pete Ricketts, like the Scott Walker, the Wisconsin governor, like the former Indiana governor, Mitch Daniels, like the current Michigan governor, Rick Snyder, who's now got the Flint, Michigan water contamination issue under his belt. These are all birds of a feather that flock together. These are the new venture capitalists that are inhabiting the state capitals in the United States. And Pete Ricketts of Nebraska is another one. So here's Pete Ricketts' mother, the governor's mother, Marlene, coming out, and she gave money to Scott Walker, the Wisconsin governor, when he was running. She's giving money to everyone but Trump in an effort to unseat Trump. What I don't really understand, though, is why she gives money indiscriminately to everyone else and not just her favorite candidate. It's this idea that Trump is not going to be fully accepted by the Republican Party, even though he's leading as a Republican in the race. His own party, the Republicans, won't accept him. And he's a venture capitalist, just like the rest of the guys I just mentioned. But for some reason, the venture capitalist crowd, the investor class, doesn't like Donald Trump, who I thought was one of them. So Trump is pushing a lot of buttons that the Republican establishment doesn't like. And it'll just be interesting to see if they'll keep him or if they'll shun him and say they want Marco Rubio. And so that we'll be watching that.
Okay, Mark, thank you for that. I just wanted to ask you if you give us a brief update on the Bundy Ranch, Oregon events. Of course, we had that really unfortunate, disgraceful shooting. Since then, it seems to have gone reasonably quiet. Many people here in UK still won't know what took place. Can you give us a little bit of an update? As an introduction, I've got the article that you've written recently for American Free Press. Activists claim Oregon turning into a police state. What's been going on there?
Well, after the shooting of Robert Lavoy Finicum, and in tandem with when Cliven Bundy, the rancher out of Nevada who made headlines in 2014 when he was arrested coming in to support the 4 holdouts at this National Wildlife Refuge in Eastern Oregon, amid all that, 2 very reliable sources who I know personally went in, Lori Storm, a well-known radio commentator, and an attorney named Roger Roots. They went in and witnessed that unmarked commando type people, presumably FBI, but without any insignia, without any badges, not even name tags, on green clad, unmarked paramilitary types were all throughout the city of Burns, Oregon, which is near the embattled wildlife refuge, and en route to the wildlife refuge that Finicum and them had occupied for most of January. So you have a lot of soldier paramilitary types out there without any insignia, occupying parts of the town, blockading streets, and treating the area like a quasi-police state. And to the best of my knowledge, a lot of that is still going on. I need to make a call even today and find out what's going on. But it's a really unfair and unnecessary action on the part of the federal government, possibly even contracting with soldier of fortune type mercenary outfits, private groups to be hired guns for the U.S. government to keep the Burns, Oregon area under control. But it's a very, very alarming action by the federal government and very unnecessary.
Okay, Mark, I'll just add to that this theme of, one, the corporatists in power that you've mentioned, people involved in big money are also the same people that seem to be driving politics. And then hand in hand with this, we've got the militarization of the police. Of course, American police have always been armed, but we'll show some pictures in a few minutes' time looking at what's happening to the British police. We also seem to have a police state forming here very quickly. Mike.
Right, United Nations COP21. Today is a signing ceremony for the agreement which came out of the COP21 climate summit held in Paris last year. It's a major priority for global leaders, as you would expect. So the biggest names attending are the leaders of Peru, France and Morocco. These just happen to be the presidents of recent climate change meetings, as COP20, COP21, and also Morocco, the upcoming COP22. So in other words, I'm being sarcastic there. There's basically no interest among world leaders at all to attend this signing ceremony. Ban Ki-moon here said it was really important for leaders from all countries to attend. And you can judge for yourself how many are going by the coverage that it's getting in the mainstream press. Absolutely none. So the response has been pretty underwhelming. And now we must move from aspirations to actions, Mr. Ban said. By implementing the Paris Agreement, we are building the future we want. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, the we is very significant, isn't it? This
Yes.
is the sort of language bandied around.
So that's what's going on today. Basically nothing. Now, of course, the other big news from the weekend was that David Cameron did his deal in Europe, apparently. The referendum PSYOP is therefore in full swing. And we do have the date of June the 23rd, a Thursday, right in the middle of the European Championships for the referendum. But I have to say, Brian, the more I look at the way these people are going at the moment, the clearer it is that they are really pretty nervous about this whole thing.
Desperate. I think they're desperate, Mike.
Absolutely desperate. Yeah. So just as an indication of how desperate they are, I just wanted to highlight John Humphreys, the absolutely sycophantic presenter of Radio 4's Today programme, who today, this morning, said to everybody, if you follow the debate on Europe, it's going to use up 200 hours of your life. And he then went on to do a 5-minute segment on the Today programme on what else you could do with that time. So they were discussing cooking, they were discussing travel, all kinds of things that you could do with 200 hours of time, in the most sarcastic way. But what it said to me was the BBC desperate to try to divert people from thinking about this whole subject.
From thinking about it in a calculated and analytical way. And if I've just given a personal opinion, it seems to me that the game is that they are ramping up the no side at the moment, because what is that going to do? That's going to mean that people who are really worried about the EU are going to think everything is okay. They're going to sit, they're going to do nothing. And then I think we can expect to see some of the no's change side. Michael Gove, I would believe, would be one of the key ones. So BBC, it's not worth bothering your little heads with. Go and do something else, go gardening. And meanwhile, the opposition controlling both sides of the debate.
Absolutely. And this, to me, this is another example of how desperate they are to do exactly that. So they've put Boris Johnson, he's backing Brexit, apparently. That's what he's saying. He is claiming to be on the no side. I believe that's a total lie. His father was on the Radio 4 Today programme this morning telling everyone that this was a career-ending decision for Boris. And I believe that's just a load of nonsense. So Boris has been deployed. He's been deployed to take control of the no campaign and to make sure that he is the strongest personality in the no camp. He is the person that the mainstream media is going to go to, and he is going to control the no campaign from here until June. So this is a PSYOP, a psychological operation, absolutely designed to control both sides of the argument. Well, here we go. Because, of course, one of the biggest reasons we would want to stay in Europe is financial and economic. And so here's another part of it, an attack on sterling. Who's doing this? It could be a normal reaction by the markets, in quotes, to Cameron's news, or is it George Soros up to his tricks?
Should we allow Mark an answer to that one? Soros seems to be getting everywhere at the moment, but also he's coming out in the public domain a bit more. Do you think that Soros is really the driving force behind the decline of the banks and the move for the one world banking system?
Well, certainly he plays a role. I don't have anything specific or concrete right at the moment at my fingertips on that. The Brexit thing, that's for Britain to possibly leave the European Union, correct?
Yep.
That was discussed in a newspaper interview in the Financial Times on the cusp of the last Bilderberg meeting in Austria by Martin Wolf, a frequent Bilderberg journalist attendee. And he interviewed people, and they talked about Brexit in the sense that it appears that Bilderberg would not want Britain to leave the European Union. Of course, that's a very powerful behind-the-scenes group, but I'll just recall that as a contribution here today.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, we'll just jump back to the EU referendum PSYOP, because some very interesting information has come out to do with Mr. Cameron and his views on Europe. These are the so-called banana emails, so-called because at one point David Cameron says, well, either this or I'm a banana. We'll just give you a flavour for that fruit today, because there's quite a lot here, but just so that you can see the sheer duplicity of David Cameron, lies or duplicity or both. But of course, what sort of Prime Minister have we got? Well, One Direction, he believes, is very important. One Direction occurring on the EU, and that is to lie or to be duplicitous in what you say. So if we have a look at these emails, they go back to 2000, February 2000, when a gentleman, Dr. Gabb, was asking members of the Tory party questions to see whether they were actually for or against the EU. And in this one, it says, this is from David Cameron back to Sean Gabb, and it says, some time ago, I sent you an email asking for my definition as a question mark on the candidates list to be changed on the basis that I oppose the single currency and any further transfer of sovereignty from the UK to the EU. You came back to me with two questions. And Mr. Cameron noticed the address carlton.com says that he was having some computer problems, but now he can answer the questions. And he said, question one is simple. Yes, I would oppose UK entry into the Eurozone, even if the leadership recommended it. And the email goes on. Question two, if required to choose between accepting the supremacy of European law and leaving the European Union, would you vote for British withdrawal? I find that puzzling. The fact is that European law, EU law, is already supreme in various areas. So there was a very interesting statement by David Cameron back in 2000. He believed that the EU was already supreme in certain areas within the UK. And the discussion between these two goes on. But I'm just going to remind you, one direction on the EU, which is to keep lying. And here we are. Mr. Gabb goes back to David Cameron. I've read your email and must take issue with your claim that the European Union law is already supreme. Parliament is sovereign. It passed the European Communities Act. It's chosen to allow other bodies to exercise a wide jurisdiction under that act, but it can appeal the act at any time it feels inclined. Now, we might perhaps take issue with the idea that Parliament is sovereign, but nevertheless, we can see the depth of the debate going on here. And it says here, the European Communities Act only becomes unrepealable if Parliament dissolves itself and hands on the act as part of the constitutional law of a less powerful successor body. I think, Mike, you might say, well, that's exactly what the government is trying to do at the moment. We give the power to the European Union, and then we find that our Westminster Parliament is broken up into regional governments, which are all under control. But Mr. Gabb says here, what British soldier or police officer would lift a finger to execute the writ of some European courts? And it's the next bit which is key. If, on the other hand, you're right, your complacent tone does you no credit whatever, if without any consultation of the people, if with a lubrication of deliberate falsehood, we really had been placed under the supreme jurisdiction of a foreign power, that would justify and even require immediate action. So a very serious debate here, but back in 2000, Sean Gabb was picking up the fact that David Cameron being utterly duplicitous in the way he was dealing with the status of the European Union. And it went on here. There were some other points. Of course, I agree that Parliament is sovereign. This is Cameron coming back to have another try. Of course, I agree that Parliament is sovereign and could choose to repeal the European Communities Act, and it should retain the ability to do so. If, as an MP, I was asked to choose between retaining Parliament's sovereignty and giving it up, I would vote to retain it. What I'm trying to say by saying that EU law is supreme in various areas is that the treaties that have already been signed, like the Single European Act, have committed us to accept rules in various areas. So this is pretty woolly stuff from Cameron after he's been challenged, but the inference is, of course, that the EU is in control. He goes on to say, I am not a lawyer, and perhaps my original email put it the wrong way, but these are my views. No to the single currency, no to further transfer of power from Westminster to Brussels, and yes to renegotiation of areas like fish, where the EU has been a disaster for the UK. If that's being a Europhile, then I'm a banana. Really, Mike, you read through this, and Sean Gabb goes on to say, thanks for your clarification. He used an interesting phrase here. He says, I'm not sure that you go quite far enough to qualify under the candidate definition of Eurosceptic. However, you may well qualify under other definitions, to which I would say, well, a liar and a duplicitous duplicitous MP. This is a huge game that's being played out here.
Yeah.
David Cameron goes on to give thanks. He says he's opposed to the single currency. We shouldn't pass on powers to Brussels. This is absolute waffle.
So he's kept us out of the euro because his paymasters tell him to do that, but he hasn't done either of the other two things that he said he would do.
No, and of course what seems to be at the back of his mind is, well, don't worry, because the European Union is already in control. I'll just remind people that, of course, with respect to the fishing industry, British fishing industry, which has been absolutely decimated by the common fisheries policy, the European policy, these are some of the articles that you can easily find where people were saying this is outrageous, Britain's fishing industry utterly destroyed. David Cameron has not lifted one finger to help. He's too busy playing around with young boys, pop stars, in or out of Westminster. But on it goes here. Mail, we've got Richard Littlejohn, how Britain was sold down the river. And Reuters here, furious with Europe, British fishermen lament demise of trade. This is just outrageous, Mike. I prefer to use the term treason. Mark, I don't know how David Cameron is viewed in the States. Hopefully you don't see a lot of him on American TV. Do you see anything of this man at all?
Only primarily when you turn on C-SPAN and these wide-ranging broadcasts they do. They'll show the British Parliament in action and Cameron debating them in the customary fashion. I would just comment that the treaty law, the idea that treaties can override or sidestep your domestic law, is a very serious issue in the UK and the United States. NAFTA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, these are treaties. These trade deals ultimately are treaties, and they ask nations to do things that often contradict their domestic organic law. And so then you have people like Cameron saying, well, sure, I respect UK sovereignty, unless there's a treaty or we have, previous agreements. Well, that right there, that's extreme double talk. That is, on the one hand, I support sovereignty. On the other hand, these trade deals basically override or at least bypass or sidestep our own domestic lawmaking. So these leaders on both sides of the Atlantic are talking out both sides of their mouth.
Okay, totally agree with that. We just remind people of who's really in control in UK, and it's certainly not David Cameron. This is a very simple overview, but David Cameron is really just the media puppet. He's good for posing outside Westminster with pop groups. The man running the country is this man, Oliver Letwin, apparently former NM Rothschild employee. This is the man driving government policy. He is running the Cabinet Office. And we are increasingly told he is the man running the Tory party with a rod of iron. There is no question that he would allow some form of division over Europe. The only thing he would approve is a scam where they're playing both sides. Remember that his number two is Mr. Transparency himself, Conservative Transparency Minister Francis Maude. This man heavily involved with Common Purpose, of course, Common Purpose to be used to train over 200 civil servants in a dirty little backroom deal. The powerhouse is this man. It's Sir Jeremy Hayward, the head of the civil service, and even the Guardian, which is a very pro-government newspaper, is describing him as the most potent, permanent and elusive figure in British politics. So he's there as the cement in the middle. And let us also remember that they're fully linked into this outfit, the Behavioural Insights team. And this is essentially now the government's own propaganda unit using applied behavioural psychology to change the way the public thinks in every direction. We can be very, very sure these people are going to be heavily used to skew any form of debate over the EU and within the referendum process. And let us also remember, of course, that it's the same people that made the brutal attempt to take control of British press under Leveson. So we just superimpose the latest over the top. And these are the people who are now really controlling the country. Mike, there is no democracy of any form amongst these people. I think Mark Anderson's described it correctly. We've got people with huge and immensely powerful money, banking and corporate interests now running politics as if it was just a private and predominantly old boys club. And where's it leading us to? Well, let's link in with what Mark Anderson's been talking about. This is an incident not far away from Plymouth, Paignton in Devon, where a couple of days ago it was reported that a man was armed or got some form of armament in his house. Huge numbers of armed police turned up. This is a small fraction. I think there was about 17 police cars. There were men dressed in this sort of outfit in attendance. Eventually the man came back to his house totally bemused because he'd been for a walk in the woods, and even neighbours had no idea what had caused this furore. But of course we should remember the type of people in the background driving this policy, that we're now seeing armed paramilitary police on the streets of Britain, and this is going to continue until the British public says we are not having this. And that is what has got to happen. It's almost unbelievable to say that this is the picture of Britain we're seeing, just say after 10 years. Certainly if we go back 20, 25 years, this is British policing unrecognisable. I mean, are they even human beings under that outfit?
Stormtroopers, Brian.
Stormtroopers.
Right. Okay. Encryption, because of course Theresa May's Snoopers Charter, we're naturally having a backlash to that. But I have to say, I'm going to be a little cynical about Apple's claims to be civil libertarians. I think this is a load of nonsense. It's the same kind of battle, actually, as net neutrality in a sense. It's a false one because we've got a corporation here pretending that it's standing up to government. I believe this is a marketing exercise. Apple's trying to convince the world that it's fighting national governments. It'll fail in the end, but at least it tried, and it won't end up on the receiving end of any kind of nasty backlash that it might have received if it simply capitulated. Now, the Brookings article here, as you might expect, is very pro the government having encryption, although they do give Apple a hard time, but not for the same reasons that I am. And they say here, so that here's the question: does the public accept this heroic self-presentation, or does the public come to see Apple's posture here as fundamentally self-serving and anti-communitarian? Is Apple not adopting the position of gun manufacturers towards Second Amendment rights, or the strategy of big tobacco as it worked to fight regulation while invoking the lack of regulation as a liability shield? Following this well-trod path is Apple's right, of course, and perhaps it's a rational call by one of the corporations with one of the world's largest market capitalizations. But the final decision here doesn't belong to Tim Cook. It belongs to the people, and it's time for Congress to act. So Brookings is calling for Congress to act. Brookings believes that governments should have the right to have access to encrypted material held on phones, computers, and other places. It's going to be a bit of a fight between us as individuals and these corporate and government interests, because I don't believe they're on opposite sides of the fence here. Apple is in total control of their products. They control the hardware. They write the firmware that controls the hardware. They write the operating system which we use to use the hardware, and they write many of the applications, and they encourage people to store their data on their own, on Apple's cloud infrastructure. So at each of these levels, Apple could implement, if they haven't already, some kind of backdoor giving governments access to encrypted data. Who would know? Because it would need a whistleblower from Apple of the scale of Edward Snowden, perhaps, and that type of person doesn't come around too often. But nevertheless, there are some serious points in this debate, and this is one of them, because Apple, of course, started this whole publicity furore by issuing an open letter, which they published, and Privacy International here pointing out that under Theresa May's latest investigatory powers bill, if that were to become law, then Apple would have been prohibited from issuing this letter, and people would effectively not be aware of whether or not there was any kind of discussion going on about whether encryption, there should be backdoors written in. Now, the point that most people are making, of course, is that if governments have access to encryption, if governments can decrypt encrypted material, then so can hackers and so can criminals. So I'm going to say I applaud the work of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Let's Encrypt Mozilla, and other people in this debate. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to us as individuals about how much of a fight this becomes. But I'm pretty cynical about Apple's part in it. Mark, have you got any thoughts on this?
A little. It's interesting and curious that Brookings is involved. Brookings, one of the most Bilderberg connected think tanks in the entire world. That's a footnote there. I agree with you, Mike. It sounds a little disingenuous, this whole thing. It's almost as if Apple wants to be the civil libertarian for publicity's sake as much as maybe for liberty's sake. I guess we'll see. But the bottom line is there's no surprise that Brookings, which is in favor of the collusion of the private sector and government to the nth degree, it's no surprise that they would want government to have a more intrusive stance and more surveillance powers. So we'll see how this develops to see if Apple's being real about this. Hopefully they are, and hopefully they'll stand up against more government surveillance, which is already way over the top.
Okay. So, final main story today, finance. This is from a few days ago. 3 of the FTSE 100's riskiest dividends, Royal Bank of Scotland Group, Lloyds Banking Group and Barclays PLC, and this is the Motley Fool, asking, well, they're saying, in recent articles, I've been running some tests to gauge business and financial quality to see if dividends seem built to last in some of the popular FTSE 100 companies. Of the firms considered, Royal Bank of Scotland, Lloyds Banking Group and Barclays scored the lowest, suggesting fragile forward payouts, and then it goes on to explain why that is. So it is perhaps a little surprising under those circumstances that those organisations and HSBC are ready to pay out dividends despite the fact that they're effectively bankrupt. So what are we looking at here? Lloyds looking to pay shareholders $2 billion. HSBC and Barclays, as well as Royal Bank of Scotland, they're expected to hand out bonuses of $5 billion. The question in this article here is, will the Bank of England permit these dividend payments and bonuses? Well, of course they will. And after all, as much money as possible has to be gotten out of the system pretty much as quickly as possible now, Brian.
Well, if you're in the system and you know that big parts of the system are going to collapse, you want to get your money out as fast as possible, I would think.
Yeah. Bank of Ireland also, sorry, I get myself mixed up here. Bank of Ireland also getting in on the act. They're going to be paying a dividend for the first time since 2008. But let's just keep in mind where the financial system actually is. So Bloomberg Gadfly talking about the situation with commodities, a $3.6 trillion black hole. They say, Christopher Langer here says, markets rallied this week after it became clear that some of the world's biggest oil producers were going to curb production and stop prices from dropping any further. The news also buoyed other commodities from coal to iron ore. Then everything dropped on Thursday with oil. Before the global financial crisis, a rise in raw materials prices used to be bad news for the economy and stocks in general. Since central bank easy money policies took off, that's become a thing of the past. And he talks about $2.1 trillion of outstanding debt to bond investors and other debt. And he's saying it is unclear where the other portion of the $3.6 trillion in liabilities lies, but probably most of it is owed to banks. They're not going to get it. The banks don't have the capital that they say that they have, and they're living on this funny money, which is going to see them, they're going to pay it out in the form of dividends and
then disappear. Well, absolutely. Well, that brought a smile to the end of the news. Mark, 30 seconds just to close on whatever you would like.
Well, it's been an interesting show today. One of the main things I'll be looking at is trying to get a little bit more on Justice Scalia's passing, at least some due diligence on the details, among a number of other issues. Looking at when Congress will vote on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I plan on covering a protest against the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, that big lobby, March 20th in Washington D.C. I should be there. Lots of interesting things coming up, and we'll be informing your audience on those.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for joining us this morning. We'll let you go to get your breakfast, and I suspect you'll need that badly needed cup of coffee now. But thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're just going to end on a few people wanting to leave the planet.
Yes, NASA inundated with astronaut applications, 18,300 people applying for 14 jobs. This is the largest application for people wanting to become astronauts since the 1970s. And that was just what I was wondering. Have they had enough? Or they want to leave the planet?
Yeah. Of course, they're going to be checked if they've got any debts before they're allowed to get into
travel,
the astronaut travel centre. Okay, well, that's our news roundup for today.
Sorry, just before we go, I just want to mention Ian. There's no Ian Crane tonight. Ian will be producing his programs live on Thursday evening this week. He is on his travels today.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today. I'd just like to say we are increasingly getting communications from people who are very, very concerned about what's happening in the country as a whole. But we will say at the moment, stay focused on what Parliament is doing with respect to the European vote, because, of course, if they win that vote, they've got a leverage to say, well, that's it, it's all over. Of course, it won't be. But don't sit at home worrying, do something, because it's action that takes away the fear. And ultimately, we need as many good people as possible taking some action if we're going to stop what's happening in the UK today. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.